On Between the Lines, the Academy Award-winning director and one of America's greatest filmmakers, Ron Howard. I'm Barry Kibrick. From his first film appearance in The Music Man to his iconic acting roles as Opie Taylor and Richie Cunningham, it will still be his work as a director that leaves an indelible mark on our consciousness. His Academy Award-winning film Apollo 13 and his Oscar for directing A Beautiful Mind are just two of his honored movies that underscores Ron's passion for film and the audiences that cherish them. Now with his latest film, Nixon, already nominated for 5 Golden Globes and sure to be an Oscar contender, Ron may be giving us his best work ever. For not only do we get to glimpse behind the scenes of history, but you'll be swept away by the passion and the power of its stars and its director.
I'm a writer today because I was a reader when I was 11 years old, and it was...
You do not need to prove your state of happiness to anybody.
Most of these speeches were as much as a month in preparation.
Characters, the heroes in this book, are seekers of truth in a story that involves a lot of corruption.
You don't get a chance to really talk about what's real. And this is the first thing to do.
Ron, I can't tell you, this is such a thrill, a pleasure. I was blessed to have your wife Cheryl on the show, and now truly honored to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm curious to talk to you about the film.
Well, I got to tell you, I'm going to start with these words by Richard Nixon himself, because from my take, when I heard them, I wrote them down. I was in a dark theater. By the way, I'm probably the only one that doesn't have a screener in Hollywood of the film, but that's okay. What makes life mean something is purpose. Mm-hmm. The goal, the battle, even if you don't win it. I couldn't help but when I heard those words and then finished the film, purpose on every level seemed to have been in your consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very much what the movie's about in my mind, and one of the things that separates this from any film that I've ever done, which are almost always about endeavors, but they're usually group endeavors. It's a family trying to cope with a situation. It's a group of people trying to coordinate and get something done, whether it's Apollo 13 or a movie like the Paper, which is about trying to get an edition out with the right story and so forth. Here, you've got these two guys who are really lone wolves. I mean, they're men with an agenda and they're battlers in their own way. And I think that's what Peter Morgan probably identified about the dynamic between these two. Very, very competitive individuals at a moment where they both needed to win. So that drive, that purpose, I think it's informed both of these characters. Characters who had teams, but they weren't about their teams. They were about themselves.
But at the same time, and I agree, there was no team, it was those two lone wolves. You seem to have, I got to level with you, I'm fascinated by two other characters in this film. Mm-hmm. Reston, played by Sam Rockwell, mm-hmm. and Jack Brennan, played by Kevin Bacon. For some reason, it seemed like, and I didn't see the play, so I don't know how if it follows it, but it seemed like you were able to use them to show us almost the underbelly mm-hmm. of what was going on.
Well, they are used in the play. In fact, in the play, the Reston, Sam Rockwell, and Brennan, played by Kevin Bacon, those characters actually, in a sort of our town kind of style, turn and narrate. So those characters, you're right, those characters became very, very important to me.
I'd like to give Richard Nixon the trial he never had.
Of course, we'll be asking difficult questions.
Difficult questions? The man lost 21,000 Americans and 1 million Indo-Chinese during his administration. He only escaped jail because of Ford's pardon.
Yes, but equally going after him in some knee-jerk way. Assuming he's a terrible guy. Wouldn't that only create more sympathy for him than anything else?
Right now, I submit it's impossible to feel anything close to sympathy for Richard Nixon. He devalued the presidency, and he left the country that elected him in trauma. The American people need a conviction, pure and simple. The integrity of our political system, of democracy as an idea, entirely depends on it. And if in years to come people look back and say it was in this interview that Richard Nixon exonerated himself, that would be the worst crime of all.
And you see the scene when Reston, he wants to grill. That's the whole thing. I got to make sure we grill Nixon.
Right.
And then you see the scene of Jack, who feels that both things could happen. By the way, they think the same thing may occur with the interview. And one is to, though, exonerate. One is to give trial to.
Frost is just not in your intellectual class, sir. You're going to be able to dictate terms, rebuild your reputation. If this went well, if enough people saw it, revised their opinion, you could move back east way, way earlier than we expected.
You think?
I'm certain.
It would be so good to go back to where the action is. You know, the hunger in my belly is still there, Jack. I guess it all boils down to Watergate, huh?
That's nothing to worry about, sir. It's not as if there's going to be any revelations. Stuff's been combed over 1,000,000 times. No one has pinned anything on you.
The goal is never to create sympathy for Richard Nixon. You know, far from it. In fact, I think we tried to inject sort of as many details about the abuses of power as we possibly could within the framework of the story. More references, more facts, more acknowledgement. But so not sympathy for Nixon, but empathy. And I love what Frank Langella had sort of come to understand about the character, and his version is not an imitation by an impression of Nixon, but it does ring true because it seems to kind of come from this very soulful place. And when you talk to Frank about it, he goes all the way back to Nixon's childhood and tried to understand responses, positions, attitudes based on what he learned about sort of Nixon as a very young man. Well, that soulful kind of approach, particularly for somebody who I suspect is rather empathetic, is going to be winning in a way. Not never our intention to make any apologies for what he did.
And in fact, none made, except that he himself does defend his actions in a very plausible manner. When you look at, I'll tell you a funny anecdote that's in the film. I love that. I'll tell you a funny anecdote that's in the film. The shoes and the loafers.
Right.
And there is, and we don't have a clip of this, but there's a scene where Nixon is asking Jack about the fact that Frost wears these Italian loafers.
Right.
And I have this thing with my son all the time about loafers and sandals, and I say, a man needs to wear the laces. But wait, so you're laughing, but here's what
I got laces.
I know, but here's what I think was important about that scene, and I know there are so many nuances in the film, but in that scene, what I got the sense was, Reston wanted to attack, Frost wanted to attack, but Jack was a protector. Jack was the Secret Service man assigned to protect Nixon. And Nixon himself was a protector. The only thing he swears on is to defend and protect this country. So I didn't see it so much as one was effeminate, one wasn't. I saw it as really the separation. You laid it out in such a way where there are people who are protectors, whether they did right, whether they did wrong, they are protectors. And I felt that throughout the film.
Well, it's very interesting, and I think, look, I think Nixon really, he's a paradoxical kind of figure. That's what makes him so fascinating to people, and he's practically Shakespearean. He's a lot of things, including funny. Although people who worked with him, he wasn't necessarily intentionally funny, but even they can't help but sort of go into the Richard Nixon imitation and tell funny stories about how socially awkward he was, or how he would sort of say the inappropriate thing unintentionally. But they also all continue to hold him with great respect and great regard. The thing that Peter Morgan was always writing about was this feeling, and I know I heard it from a number of people who'd worked for Nixon, that he just never seemed to be comfortable in his own skin. He always felt like that guy, that kid, who was on the outside looking in, you know, wondering if he'd ever get in there to play with those toys. And Frost was, at that point in his life, you know, really was a globe-trotting playboy. He was a huge superstar. He was the first major television star on British television, and was trying to make this transition. But he led this lifestyle that Peter Morgan is convinced Nixon coveted. And so, you know, if Peter were here, he'd be saying that, you know, the loafers were all about freedom and modernity and liberation.
Here I go again. I'm disagreeing with Peter Morgan. And you. All right. So, all right. I have to say why. There's a scene at the end, as we do have a nice clip of, when Nixon, and you just mentioned it before, you get the sense he's envious on one level of Frost's ability to party. And I do agree with that. But he also knows that he could never be that kind of man. He knows that he is serious. I know. I could never go to the Hollywood parties.
Right.
I hate them
right.
with a passion.
Yeah.
But having conversation, having one-on-one, with intelligence, with even just a sense of soul. So I think he was envious because, you know, I too wish I could have been that frat boy that just could suck down the shots and drink the beers and not give a care.
Right.
But deep down, I don't know, there's more meaning to life. Going back to the original thing I said, something of purpose. Nixon had it.
Do you know those parties of yours? The ones that I read about in all the papers. Do you actually enjoy those?
Of course.
You got no idea how fortunate that makes you. Liking people, being liked, having that facility, that lightness, that charm. I don't have it. I never did. It kind of makes you wonder why I chose a life that hinged on being liked. I'm better suited to a life of thought, debate, intellectual discipline. Maybe we got it wrong. Maybe you should have been a politician and I the rigorous interviewer.
Maybe.
Nixon had a profound sense of the possibility that he could be an important historical figure. Well, he you know, he was and is, probably not for the reasons that he would have wanted, but you know, he read history constantly. A very scholarly man, very scholarly man.
Oh, and strategically, by the way, you point out how he thinks. Brilliance just really oozes from him.
Yeah, well, I'm forgetting the title. De Gaulle's memoirs. It was one of his favorites, and Frank Langella actually got the folks at the Nixon Library to let him actually have a look at the book, and you see, you know, Nixon's notations. He would pore over what he read and study, and he was constantly trying to improve himself, all in the spirit of being ready for that moment when, you know, when a historical decision, you know, would need to be made.
You know, there's another line. I don't know if it's again the play or the book, but again more so the way you captured it, and it was from David's producer, I believe, and he said David doesn't do failure.
Right.
Yet we know for a fact that Nixon not only does failure, but he does failure over and over and over again. And I couldn't help but think, though, when you really do look at great figures, and I don't even want to take sides if they're great morally or whatnot, but just great figures, whether it's from Churchill to Moses, and I'm not saying Nixon's one of these people, they've all had tremendous failures and then rebirths, failures and rebirths. There's something about that in the human spirit that you bring out in this particular version of Frost Nixon that I found grabbed me at a level very deep.
Well, that's great. Look, again, two really dogged, kind of indomitable figures. And both actors, Michael Sheen and Frank Langella, had so much to offer in terms of what they'd learned about these characters. David Frost is incredibly competitive, and the remarkable thing about him is that he doesn't really acknowledge losing. He really doesn't. That idea of doesn't know how to fail. Of course he's failed. Right after this Nixon interview, where he was riding high, he had a debacle of an interview with Henry Kissinger, where Kissinger basically walked out. And it was supposed to be a similar sort of a lengthy special, and it turned into like a, he managed to get one interview out of it. But he had failed relationships and humiliations, but he just sort of would never acknowledge them. I think Nixon would acknowledge them and use them as fuel. I think Frost's idea was to pretend they never happened and just carry on. Two very different ways of sort of arriving at the same goal, just a mindset of constantly moving forward.
Oh, when Nixon says, "I've got the hunger in my belly, I can't sit still, I must keep moving forward." There is a clip I'm going to show. I mean, there's clips throughout the show we're going to show, but one I want to talk about. And it's the classic one, it's the call.
We're not going to let that happen, either of us. We're going to show those bums. We're going to make them choke on our continued success, our continued headlines, our continued awards and power and glory. We are going to make those mothers choke. Am I right?
You are. Except only one of us can win.
Yes. And I shall be your fiercest adversary. I shall come at you with everything I got. Because the limelight can only shine on one of us.
I had an interpretation that so far has been different from everyone I've spoke to, and I want to share it with you. And the viewers will see the scene, but I'm actually going to take us to the scene right before it. What makes Nixon want to make this call? And there's a two-part to it. One I thought was he was almost becoming friendly with Frost and felt bad that he was pulverizing him. I know that sounds funny, but there's an element there that I almost think he's friendly with this guy to one level. There's that other element that I really believed he wanted to confess to the American people. And here's the shot that I had needed to ask you about. It's right before he gets too drunk. He's playing the piano in his house. And there is this, and again, I don't have this part of the clip, but there's a moment you take of his face, and something seems to be going on in his eyes. And I wrote down as I was watching that, there's some sense of epiphany Nixon's having at that moment.
Well, there was a lot of conversation about that moment, among all of us, Peter Morgan, Frank Langella, and myself. We all had a slightly different perspective on it, by the way. But it was a brand new scene. And it was something that I called for in the adaptation. And I said, I think we need to check in with Nixon, but somehow between the final interview and this phone call. And we didn't know quite how to do it. And then the funniest thing happened. In the research, we saw this appearance that Nixon made on The Tonight Show when Jack Parr was the host in 1961 or 62. It was after his failed, it must have been 62, after his failed gubernatorial run in California. And he was joking around about that, and he wound up playing the piano. And he played a composition of his own. And he was a pretty fair musician. During his childhood, he'd gone through a period where he had an aunt that made him practice and practice and practice. And we thought this was fascinating. I took it to Hans Zimmer, the composer, and I said, "Hey, take a look at this, Hans. This is sort of interesting, isn't it?" We asked the Nixon family if they'd let us have the rights, and they said they would. And we thought, well, we should include this somewhere. This is interesting. Hans Zimmer started playing it back and forth to us and said, "This is practically Freudian, this composition of his and the way he plays it." it tells you so much. It's systematic, it's confined, it's dogmatic. He gets angry at himself and because he misses a note and he hits the note. Watch the way he hits that note. He said, this is really remarkable. You've got to use this piece of music. And we decided to build a scene around it. So then we found out that Nixon used to occasionally gather everyone around him and play for them. And that it would be kind of a chore, a duty for everyone, but that, that they would do it. And the scene began to grow. And then we realized that Frost had this very colorful, outrageous Hollywood party for his birthday where Neil Diamond was singing to him. And we decided to contrast that party with Nixon. Here's how Frost parties, here's how Nixon parties, playing his own composition for his staff. And then the light bulb went off. And Peter Morgan said, this is it. When it's over, this is the moment for everyone else to be celebrating, and Nixon isn't celebrating. And we can see that he either thinks he doesn't deserve to win, doesn't think he actually can win, thinks they're all celebrating too soon, or something. But it's that dark moment that will just pique our curiosity about the man, what's going on. And then the next thing we see is what's a very self-destructive act, this phone call that actually provokes Frost to really, get his A game in gear. And it's interesting that you've cited that scene because it's one of the things that came out of the adaptation and the collaboration between Peter Morgan and myself and the new research that most excited both Peter Morgan and I. And I think it's a very pivotal scene, but there's almost no dialogue in it. And yet, I think it does a lot for the film.
I know, I saw that, and I had the epiphany at that moment as well. As you said, I was empathizing. I'm not sympathizing, I was empathizing.
Well, Frank Langella has this theory about Nixon. And it, again, it's Frank Langella's Nixon, and it's an interpretation, of course. But it's very interesting, and that is that Nixon was better at climbing the ladder than ever reaching the top rung and sort of stepping through that window. And that Nixon would get to the top and somehow have to tumble back down again. And he understood climbing. He didn't understand, sort of being at the summit. And I think he's just haunted by the fact that Watergate was too big to be swept under the rug, and if he was going to carry on, he was going to have to finally face the American public in some way.
Well, the line that I think sent it home for me was, I'm going to read it exactly because I don't want to miss it. He said, "I let the system down.
Mm-hmm.
I know that now good people won't want to go into politics."
Yeah.
And I felt his pain at that moment.
Directly out of the transcript, and that's what's so wonderful about Peter Morgan's writing, is that you go into this and these great moments are there. They were there in the interviews, although spread out over hours and hours and hours. Condensed, they become all the more powerful and potent. And he managed to weave that into these scenes that are all supposition and creativity, inspired by the research and what we all come to learn about the real men. But he understood and discovered, that there was so much more beyond the interviews and what there was available there on the transcripts, that the chaos behind the scenes was so entertaining, and it presents suspense and humor and this kind of human interest story that surprises everyone. And one of the reasons why I think that the feedback I'm getting on the movie is right there with any of the more popular films of mine and awarded films of mine. I think people are so surprised by this story. I think they go in expecting to kind of admire it or be in some way informed by it, and that instead it winds up being this very entertaining story.
Ron, you have entertained us for years, and I am so grateful that you've joined us today.
Thank you.
Thank you
I
so
enjoyed the
much.
conversation.
And thank you guys for joining us. Now, before Ron leaves, I'd like to leave you with these words from Frost Nixon that I began the show with. What makes life mean something is purpose, the goal, the battle, even if you don't win. I'm Barry Kibrick. Look between the lines and the missing minutes of the tape of your life, and you will find purpose, and life will mean something, even if you don't win. Thank you so much, Ron.
Pleasure.
My pleasure.
I'm going to take that advice with me home tonight.
If you'd like a tape of our show or would like to become a member of our book club and receive our weekly email show updates, just write us at barrykibrick@aol.com.